Hello, ngHouston. I hope you guys got lots of turkey last week, and now we're back this week. Tonight we have Paul Spears is talking about his Angular Performance Playground, so we're going to dive right into that. But first, we're going to introduce the panel. Corey, you want to say hello?
Hi, name's Corey Ryland. I'm one of the Help Angular Bootcamp instructors.
Yeah, Corey's pretty cool. And Corey, you have a pretty cool blog, right?
Yep, try to write as much down before I forget it.
And what's it called?
It's just CoreyRyland.com.
RYLAN.
Yep.
Corey Ryland. Yeah, it's pretty cool. I found some answers there myself before I even knew who you were. So, yeah. Okay, and we have Sean Paul. And Sean, I have to tell everybody, I twisted his arm and made him come because he's been on the chat a couple times and he's been asking some really good questions. So I kind of pulled a Rob on him and told him just come on in and be on the panel. So welcome, Sean. You want to say hello?
Hi, everyone. My name's Sean. I'm a developer here in Houston. Yeah.
Awesome. Sorry, I had the screen focused on Paul and Bill. Speaking of Paul and Bill, you want to say hello?
Hi. Hello, everyone.
Okay, so I think we're ready to jump right in. And Paul, I'm going to focus the screen on you. And if you want to share your screen and just jump in, and then as you go along, we'll stop you and bug you and heckle you and ask you questions.
Sure.
And you guys in the watching along, if you're in the live stream, then you can also ask questions on the chat, and we will ask Paul.
All right. So, well, thanks for having me. I figured I'd come on here and just tell everyone a little bit about this application I made called the Angular Performance Playground. For me, this was just a pet project that kind of exists for the purpose of just kind of giving me a spot to kind of play with some of the Angular features, Angular concepts, and I kind of also used it along the way to say, all right, how can we make some like really high performance Angular applications? And it really got its start when I was working on a customer project, and we had a need for a graph kind of similar to what you see on the screen here. Fairly common D3 force-directed graph. The problem they're trying to solve, it was well suited for it, but we wanted to avoid going all the way to like rendering this stuff on this highly performant canvas, because what we needed to do was just not really complex enough to warrant the work of going to this this approach of canvas. So we're just like, all right, well, let's just play with Angular and what it can do with SVG and just kind of go from there. And so like out of trying to figure all that out, I made the Angular Performance Playground. So in terms of like what it does and what it's for, it is probably the least helpful application in the world. It is simply just like, here's a visual, here's a list, I can sort the list, and as I type things in it, it automatically kind of filters it. I can increase the number of things in the list and we see it render, and kind of track the frame rate along the way. And so it kind of all started as just my own little pet project. And as I kept showing it to people, everyone was like, that's really awesome, you should show more and more people. So I finally just said, all right, let's go ahead and just put it out there. And so you can get to it, in theory, from going to angularperformanceplayground.com. However, for some reason, I cannot. Hopefully it will work for you. So
it does work for me.
Okay.
So great. I was looking at the code for this earlier, and I was thinking this is actually under the hood. Some of it is really complicated in that rendering. The way that the dots kind of move like that, it is pretty complicated. But then I was thinking like that's kind of the whole point of this is the performance, because it's so challenging to make that run smoothly and quickly. That's kind of where this came along, right?
Right. And so, like for example, right here, some of the metrics that we're seeing here, like they got different numbers and like what do they mean? The 262 entries, that represents like each dot on the screen. But those dots, like there's actually like quite a bit of different things that we have to bind to actually represent that dot. And so each dot and each line on the screen as it moves around, in the template there are like a number of bindings for each one of those. Similarly, like we also have that same data bound to the list on the left. And so this number here, this actually represents like the total number of template bindings that are actually in the code for this screen. So it's like some factor of the 262 entries. And so at the end of the day, this is just over 2,000 bindings that we have to change. And the idea is to try and get them to change at a rate of 60 frames per second. And here on this machine, we've achieved that. And so Like if you do all the math on all of that, that means that we're able to move the position of every one of these nodes and then have Angular update the bindings and have those updates re-render once in less than 16 milliseconds. So every 16 milliseconds or less, that entire process happens. So let's go ahead and take a look, I guess, at the code for this. So the repo itself, if you go to the About page, the source code, and this is totally a work in progress, so of course I have the wrong link. But if you click on that and just drop the src off the end, you'll land at the actual source code for it. And so the source code is there on GitHub. You can take a look at it. I'm going to have it up here on the screen as well. The code for it, we have a couple of different packages, but we're going to jump straight into the client package.
I just put a link to that repo in the chat, by the way.
Thanks. And within the client package, we're going to jump straight to, in my opinion, the most fun piece of source code. And so that's under client packages, client source app, graph page, graph viewer component HTML, and actually one more deep. There we go, the graph viewer display component HTML. And so this graph that we see on the page, so going back to the network graph, this right here, the template for just this portion, consists of these 13 lines of code. And so Angular has like this really cool ability to just bind directly to these native things. And that includes anything on SVG. And so the whole idea was, all right, I want to create this out of some just declarative SVG. I don't want to go through the process. Like if you use D3 normally, you have to say like, okay, my list of nodes has changed, and now I need to go through and programmatically add back all of the added and remove those that have been taken out. You just have to write a lot of code there to kind of walk through and step through the process of updating all of your nodes. And we're like, you know what, that's kind of overkill, and it's just a lot of work. What if instead we could just use our good old-fashioned ngFor? Say, you know what, for every entity, just draw a circle on the page. And so we kind of got to thinking about that and how we might be able to utilize that. We came up with the following. We're far from the only ones that have done that. And I know, I believe it was Aishigal, she has done a lot with this. I know Tero Parvanian, he's done a lot with this. And the folks over at Swim Lanes have done quite a bit with the same kind of thing. So this isn't really like a unique idea for us, but we kind of arrived at it ourselves as well. But we said, hey, let's go ahead and just bind over our list of entities and take each one and have it render a circle. And then we're going to take that movement algorithm. So that's all D3 behind the scenes. That's like figuring out like where to move all of the things. We said we're going to use that to position our nodes. And we're going to take those new updated positions, the X and Y position. We're just going to use the CSS translate to move it around on the screen. And so you can then bind to a SVG's attribute transform property, give it your translate, and then every time the X and Y position changes, it just updates that position on the screen. And you got a similar process with the links where you have the relationships, and then you bind its X and Y coordinates to the X and Y coordinates of that particular relationship based on its source and target. And so most of this code is just like knowing a little bit of like how SVG lines and SVG circles work, and then how to move them. The rest of it is just Angular taking over and stamping out a line for every line and a circle for every circle. So before I move on, any questions on the SVG kind of stuff that we're taking a look at here?
So just to be clear, this doesn't use D3 whatsoever. It's just pure SVG and CSS translate properties.
Right. For the rendering, for the responsibility of like setting up the DOM and the HTML and having it actually display, no, there's no D3 involved at all. I still use D3, and we're going to see that in just a second, to actually kind of change the X and Y property right here. So D3 is responsible for like on a timer calculating new X and Y positions. And when those X and Y position updates, this template's responsible for changing the view. All right, so it said that we're using D3 to do that, how we actually hook up to that. So here's the backing component. We're using a kind of a SmartView component pairing here. And so this component itself, it actually doesn't have much in way of actually doing anything, in terms of calculating positions or anything like that. Instead, the relationships and entities get passed down every time there's a change. So we're using change detection strategy on push to say that we're going to use immutability throughout the application, and we're going to pass in entities and their relationships anytime any property of it changes. So if we keep following this trail up, we'll see that those get passed down through this app graph viewer display. That's the component that actually has the graph, where we pass the relationships and the entities down. And so finally we can say, okay, those relationships and those entities, those are sourced from this D3 helper links and node thing right here. And so this D3 helper, it actually is going to take our links and our nodes and give those to us as an observable. I mentioned on the other side of this that we're using immutability to keep these up to date. And so what we're doing is every time the position changes, we have an observable that emits a new list, one for relationships, one for entities.
I peeked a little bit ahead at that D3 helper. We're going to go look at that, right?
Oh yeah, we're headed right there now.
Stay tuned, everybody, because there's going to be some really cool rxjs stuff going on. Hey, before you go there, though, where were you? Can you talk for just a minute about that change detection strategy? Because I think that's pretty cool, and I think people might not have seen that before.
Sure. So the idea behind the change detection strategy is that it gives us a way to kind of control how Angular actually performs its change detection. And it relates more to how this component itself, the one that we're looking at, the one that we've specified change detection on, how it should be updated, when it should be updated. And so by saying that we want to change it to on push, we're stating that we don't want the template for this component to be checked for any updates unless one of its inputs has changed. And so what that means is that we could have all kinds of various updates going on the rest of the page. So for example, over here, I have a list of all of these entities. And if I had something going on, like I had a click handler, I could click on one and see more details, or if I have some sort of on hover effect, by default, all of those kind of events would percolate through kind of the rest of the app and possibly trigger change detection. Not necessarily, but possibly trigger change detection. Or if the component internally kind of set its own property, that might trigger change detection. And all of that would then result in having this template checked. And the idea that we just mentioned was that this template contains chunks of DOM for every element. And so by changing our change detection strategy to on push, we're saying, please don't check my template unless, in this case, either a relationship list or an entity list actually changes.
So if you have a view component that is not meant to be interacted with, this is a really good choice because it can help make things run quicker.
Or even if it does need to be interacted with, it's a great way of making sure it doesn't get checked for updates any more than it really needs to.
That's awesome.
But that you can only get that kind of behavior if, in fact, all of your updates actually end up, resulting from like all of your visual updates.
Yeah, I have to jump in here and say, if this sounds like something that you're going to immediately go and start sprinkling all over your existing Angular app without making any other changes, you're going to have a bad time.
No, that's exactly what I wanted to do. I'm just going to put it in a component. Fine.
It's awesome, but
Bill.
you need to make sure that you're ready for it. So.
Yeah. Bill likes to be the downer in the room all the time.
No.
I know, right? You don't need us. Won't let us have any fun. Yeah, but it is pretty cool, and I just wanted you to point that out because I thought it was pretty cool, and I saw that in there that people might not have seen that before.
Yep. All right, so in this situation, I've intentionally constructed this so that I'm taking advantage of immutability, and when I do that, that means I can say, oh, you know what? When the relationships change, I'm going to get a new list. And that means this template will only need to be updated when one of these things actually changes. And so I can take advantage of onPush here. But let's dig in now to where we actually source the data. And so that comes from the D3 helper service. So just caveat for like everyone watching, a large portion of what this application is about is just, it's a test bed and a playground for trying out ideas. Some of these ideas, they may not be good ideas. They may be bad ideas, in fact. And I'm kind of like throwing a buffet of technology just to kind of serve as a, hey, here's how you do that. I'm not saying you should, but here's how you could. So this particular application, it takes advantage of web workers. And so if you're not familiar, web worker is a technology you can use to say, I need to run some calculations, and I can run those calculations as pure functions. I can send it data and have it come back with that data and notify the main JavaScript thread, if you will, of that information. To do is allows us to execute that information in parallel to the rest of the UI on the application. So these calculations of, yeah.
When we're talking about web workers, and I'm just curious because I feel like all of a sudden everybody started talking about web workers and they all know what it is, and I'm like, where did this term come from, right? And to me, it's like WebSockets. It's like related. It's similar to WebSockets. Can you? Because like I feel like this is one of those things, you know, everybody knows what this is all of a sudden. But I was using WebSockets. I actually looked it up today. What is a web worker? And I felt kind of silly. But if I ask the first stupid question, then it kind of opens the door for everybody else to ask questions because you can't go wrong.
Yeah.
So how long have web workers been around?
You know, I couldn't tell you. I don't know much about the genealogy of them myself. I just
I feel better now.
Yeah, like you. I was like, oh, web workers, those sound awesome. You mean to tell me I can like execute some stuff in parallel? Sure, I'll buy some of that. And I bought some of that, and now I'm a happy customer.
So I actually looked this up earlier. Hold on, I have a definition from Wikipedia: JavaScript executed from an HTML page that runs in the background independently of other user interface scripts that may also be executed from scripts on that page, which to me sounds like WebSockets, right? Because you can basically post messages to an event handler on your page.
Right. Yeah.
Which I saw this and I thought it was pretty. So you're going to show this to us. I like it.
Yep. The workflow, the kind of like the thought process around like how to interact with them, how to deal with the async nature is very akin to working with WebSockets. And so,
but the main idea behind a web worker is to get processing activity off of that single JavaScript thread that's dealing with your UI. Since JavaScript is single threaded, you need some way to not bog down that thread with other processing. Web workers are a way to do that without adding full-blown threading to JavaScript, which would break the world.
Yeah,
that's a good. And also, once you start up that web worker, then you can use that to access WebSockets.
Yeah.
There you go.
Absolutely. So the file itself, there's a lot going on this file. Like you see here, I have this like spray of rxjs operators in here, and so this is the heart of the engine. This is kind of like where every piece of like thought actually went into this particular file. So let's see, what's the easiest way to slice and dice this?
I would love to see you talk about actually. Well, I you know what, I'll be quiet and I'll just let you. And then if you, because I was excited about the subjects and behavior subjects.
Okay, so I'll just do my best to try and go through this linearly and see what happens. So the idea here is that we got to compute some graph data. That's the point. That's why we're here. And the thought is I'm going to use that web worker to go calculate the movement of that graph. And so I'm going to take all my D3 logic and let it churn in a background worker and let it notify me of updates to the positions. And as those updates arrive, you can kind of think of that as, hey, those updates are going to arrive as almost like a stream of data. And it turns out that, Angular, when you're using Angular, you have access to this great abstraction for streams of data called observables. And so they're kind of a natural fit there. So I said, what if I take that stream of updates, and as they arrive back into this thread, I just take them, pick them up, and put them into an observable. And so the way you achieve that is by generally creating either a subject or a behavior subject. And so subjects and behavior subjects, the easiest way to get started thinking about those is those are just observables in which you have access to the end of the observable that you put the data in. There's some like a little bit of nuance between a behavior subject and a subject. And that, again, this is oversimplifying, but the biggest piece of nuance is that with a behavior subject, it is a subject that you start with an initial value. So you can think of graph data, it is an observable. It is one that we can put data into. That way my subscribers can be notified of updates.
I just learned about subjects. Like I was using rxjs for a couple of months, and I didn't know anything about subjects, behavior subjects, replay. I didn't know anything about it. And then I learned subjects after I'd been using rxjs for a while, and I was so excited.
Yeah, you get to like observable all the things. It's so wonderful.
Yes, I was like, I could just do subject.next anytime I want. It was so cool. I was very excited. So if you guys are watching and you don't, and you're not really feeling confident or comfortable with subjects, behavior subjects, the different types of subjects, go check it out because they're pretty cool. Or just I'll be quiet and you can tell us right now what they're all about.
I had a question real quick. I heard that you have the worker working in the background, and then somehow you're notified that some kind of work has been done. So I'm guessing there's like an event handler somewhere around in the coding.
Yep, we're gonna get there somewhere down here. Yeah, yeah, no, this dense stuff, like the amount of things going on per line of code, like once we get down here, is kind of dense. So it takes a bit to unpack it.
See, Sean and I went through this code before you started. I don't know how you're ever gonna get to this with us stopping you every 2 seconds to ask you questions.
No, I'm glad, because I was worried that I'm gonna be over here like talking and people are gonna be completely falling asleep because it's like, I don't know what he's talking about, what he's doing. I'm just going to shut up and listen. And like, so no, I'm glad you're asking questions. It's great.
That's cool. Well, we'll try to be quiet for a minute at least, just so because I know you've got a lot of code to go through, and but it's cool. We're excited.
Yep. And all right. So we now have a way of saying, if I have some data, I've got somewhere to put it, and then we can use that data as an observable from here on out. Let's go ahead and we're going to skip sizes for a moment. It's just an observable that we use to represent the fact that, yeah, the screen itself has changed, and so we gotta adjust the positions based on that fact. Less important. We'll come back to that. Line 49. Here's where we actually create a new worker. And so this is the syntax for I need a new web worker, please. You say new worker, and you give it the path to a JavaScript file on your server that contains code written to be a web worker. And of course, we'll see that web worker code in a moment.
And you didn't import anything for this, right? It just works. Is this a TypeScript thing?
Right. Yeah. So to the best of my knowledge, and I'm not a super big expert on web workers and all that, but to the best of my knowledge, kind of like the space around like, okay, how do we write a web worker with TypeScript, and like, is there a way we can just like import it and inject it into here somehow? Like that, no one's doing that I've found. And kind of the way it's done now is everyone kind of builds their web worker as almost like a second little project off to the side that compiles down to an asset that you refer to at runtime like this.
And that worker.js, that you wrote that?
Yes, I wrote a worker. I actually did exactly what I just described, which was, if we go look at the actual list of files, I have a second project in here. It's my D3 web worker, and I actually wrote my worker as a TS file, but it has its own build process that goes through and it actually turns it into the JS file. It just kind of copies it into the right spot at the right time.
That sounds very mysterious.
So we'll unpack it in a moment. But yes, at the end of the day, you can think of it as, yes, I wrote this worker.js file, but I wrote it as a TS file, and so I'm referring to the actual build version of it right here.
Gotcha.
All right, and so with that new worker method, that will go ahead and give us back a handle on our web worker, and we're going to utilize this to poke it and say, hey, I have a new message for you. Please process this message. Similarly, we can say, oh, please inform me of messages so that way I can handle those. And we'll see that here soon. All right, so graph data. That represented the data that's going to come back from this web worker thing over time. Server data That represents the fact that we actually start this process by way of asking the server for a list of these entities and these relationships. And so we do that in the observable form. We're going to revisit line 55. All right, line 58. This is going to represent the graph data after it has been processed. So we kind of get some raw graph data back from the server. I need to turn that into something, all right, from the web worker, and I need to translate that into something that I can use in my template. So we'll see that soon as well. All right, lastly, it needs to all work in conjunction with a search. So if I come over here and actually give it a search term, actually, little bug, I'll restart it here and start typing. And as I type, the entities start to fall away. And so it has to work in conjunction with that. So while we have this web worker constantly providing us updates as a stream of information, I'm also going to represent the search value that the user typed as a stream of information. We're going to, here in a moment, we're going to take advantage of some operators in rxjs to kind of take those two streams, combine them into one that has the data that we need. All right, and let's see. So jumping down here, let's take a look at how these things are actually initialized, how we get them set up. So we're going to jump down to line 69. And so here, these are all the properties that we declared before. I just kind of mentioned what they're used for. Here's how they're implemented. So for the server data, we're going to start off by saying, okay, we have an observable that represents the number of nodes that we want to show. So we actually see here from the editor that I initialize it to 250. So when I refresh it, you see we're searching for 250 entities. So it's going to take that as an observable, and we're going to start using some operators now. So here we're going to use our first operator called switch map. So switch map is a way of saying, as data flows into this, I'm going to perform an operation on that data that in turn gives me back an observable. And so it's a way of saying, take this observable that I get back from this method, and again, a slight simplification, just pretend that that's the one I'm using right here. So I no longer want to follow the values. I want the number of nodes. I want to know, like, what are the actual results of talking to the server and getting those entries.
And that HTTP GET, that's using a HTTP client, so that will automatically return an observable, right?
Right.
Well, I think this is older code, isn't it?
Yeah, it might not be client.
But it's still going to give you an observable either way.
Yes, it's an observable. It's not using HTTP client. I haven't updated it to do that. But yes, at the end of the day, we're going to use HTTP. Where the older syntax here says that I have to first turn it into JSON. Wouldn't have had to do.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
Not have had to do that if I had client in play.
That's right.
Yeah, you got me there. I'm peddling old stuff here.
Months out of
That's
date.
okay.
Months.
So yeah, we're going to map over that response, get the entities out of it, and then these two characters are a way of saying, you know what, I also want anyone that subscribes to this data to have the results that were calculated given out to them as well. So this is kind of a really important one, because if we look over here, I've got the list of the entities displayed here, and that list is represented here in graph form. And so at the very least, in this application, we have two different endpoints that are going to subscribe in some form or another to that stream of data. And with observables, by default, anytime you have a subscription of some sort, it actually will replay that entire chain of operations, including any HTTP requests that you might have in that chain. And so if I left this off, and actually let's see if this live coding is just going to end my night. I'm going to save this.
It's a risk we take.
I got the CLI running in the background. I come over here. All right, it's all working.
Woohoo!
Let me hop on the network tab and refresh.
Now, while you're doing that, I want to
Let's
tell
see.
them, honestly, I mean, I'm following you pretty well because this makes sense to me. But if I had watched this 6 months ago, I wouldn't have known what you were talking about because, well, maybe 6 months ago, because I just learned rxjs this year. So if there's anybody watching and you guys really are having a hard time following this, you should check out probably the Jeff Cross anti-patterns, rxjs anti-patterns from a month or two ago, because it kind of breaks down this a little bit simpler. And I think this one's a little bit more advanced. But it's pretty cool stuff.
Yeah.
Because I don't think we got into the subjects, behavior subjects at all over there.
Right.
Yeah, a really good intro to, there are a lot of them out there, but a really good intro to like practical use of rxjs. If you search for any talks from Ben Lesh, there's one
Yeah.
from a year ago at Angular Connect. It's like a 40-minute talk. First 15, 20 minutes are, please don't be overwhelmed by rxjs. If you know these basic concepts and this handful of operators, it'll get you 90% of the way, and then you can add details as you need them later. Really, really good talk.
Yeah.
And I don't think I'm supposed to tell you guys this yet, but I might possibly have a lynda.com course coming out soon about that. But I don't think I'm supposed to say that. So don't tell them that I told you that.
Nice. Yeah, I was gonna say in our class, we actually tell our students that, you know what, just start with map and maybe do, you know, and maybe sprinkle in a little bit of switch map. Just start there. Get comfortable in that. Just kind of soak in that for a little bit. You'll eventually find yourself saying, you know what, I wish I had a little more power. Then go on the search for additional operators.
You know what's crazy though? I didn't know that I didn't know about subjects. Like I was just happy with the map and the observable. I was happy with that. And then when I found out about subjects, I was like, oh man, like there's more that I didn't know. I was so excited though. It was cool.
Yeah, that's great.
And I saw that a couple lines down. We're gonna actually, so this line, what is that? Line 79.
Yep.
That's why I was so excited about something, because that .next is just really, I didn't know how to, and I needed to do that and I didn't know how, and I thought I couldn't.
Yeah, it's good stuff.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so over here, so I had made that change to point out that, go look at the network tab. I mentioned how we have like 2 consumers of that graph data, and because I took off that share replay, what ends up happening is that each subscription results in there being a new fetch to that underlying data source. So now I'm like going out and potentially like hitting a server multiple times just to display the same information twice. So I don't want to do that. And so this publish replay ref count, that is one way. There are others. This is one way to say, take the data I've computed and just give that out to anyone else that comes along asking for the information. So, oops, I got some good stuff in here. So jumping on down now to 78, we'll revisit 75. Line 78, this is where we say, all right, so I've got our worker, and it's got some magical code that we'll have to go look at here in a moment. But I want to be notified of whenever they send us updates from that worker code. And so onMessage is the API call that we can make. We can actually say, I want to assign a function to this onMessage property of our worker, and please call that function anytime a new message arrives. And so the assignment I'm making is here utilizing arrow functions. I'm saying, okay, take the event that has come back from that message and do something with it. That something being, hey, that graph data behavior, let's see, graph data subject. Yep, graph data subject that we have. Go ahead and say, here is your next value. And that next value being, you know, we're defining an object kind of in line here where we're saying it has a thing called entities and a thing called relationships. And we're peeling the data off of the event, in particular, kind of paring down the entities and paring down the relationships. And so we're kind of like teasing apart the bigger data piece into something that makes sense for our graph data observable. We're pushing this data in, and anyone that has any operators or subscriptions downstream of graph data, they're going to be notified of the new data that has come in. Line 80. All right, so before I tackle line 80, was any questions about 79? All right, cool. So
I just think it's cool. There are a couple people on the chat, and I don't know how much time you have and how fast we need to move. And I know I'm interrupting you a lot, and I'm really sorry. But if you have time, can you just talk a little bit about how, like, the subjects, when you have a subject, so basically if you have an observable, like the thing that was confusing for me is if I have a button, right, or an input field, and this, they start typing, right, then I get an observable from the button or the input field. Or if I do an HTTP GET call, I get an observable back from something, right? And I grasped that, and I knew how to, I could understand that. But I didn't know how to create my own subject. And so with a subject, you create a subject, and then you can iterate it. So what you're doing is you're sending this out on the observable to broadcast it and say, now we're going to the next thing with the graph data.
Right.
And that's going on to your web worker.
Other direction. This is coming back from the web.
It's coming from the web worker. So when you get the message from the web worker, then you're going to the graph data observable and saying, okay, now send out the next ping.
Right. Right. So like if we come over here and we can actually find all the places that we use this. So we can find all references here. If we actually look at it, like I'm using this graph data in a number of places. I actually kind of reuse it twice here. It's just kind of a typo actually. And so here I then go on to use that. I call other observable operators on it and make an assignment here. I find where this is used. You see, like I take that and I call map on it. So I'm like continuing down this observable pipeline, tree-like structure of like sending that data all over my application now, just using that observable pipeline. So this might help, may actually confuse things. I'm not sure. We'll find out. If you actually, we're going to go take a peek now at like the definition of a subject. Like if you look at a subject, its type is that it extends an observable. So you can do everything to a subject that you can do to an observable. And again, like the most simple thing to like take away from that is, okay, the simplest stuff I can make is that a subject, it is an observable, but it's one that I can put data in. And that's kind of like the starting point of that understanding.
I only mentioned that because it was something that I kind of tripped over in the beginning. I didn't really pay attention to it at first.
Yep. All right. So just actually, when do we have a stop? Like when is the stop time here?
Who, us?
Yeah,
oh, we're fine. We're on YouTube. It's not like we're holding anybody hostage. We won't. As long as you.
I learned earlier today the longest video you can upload to YouTube is 12 hours. So you've got another 10 and a half.
Yeah, we don't really have a time constraint. We're pretty chill around here.
All right. So I'll wait till my wife starts calling, wondering where I'm at.
There you go.
All right. So here we're receiving those updates, and we're taking what was like this kind of asynchronous callback, constantly kind of letting me know over time about these things that have happened, and kind of immediately kind of escaping the world of this nested callback potential mess. And instead, I'm kind of converting it into an observable. And so I'm going from here's a callback constantly updating me to here's data flowing down an observable pipeline. Now, there's one little caveat to this, and that is Angular is kind of magical. It has an awareness of all kinds of things. So if you've heard any talks on how zones work, seen how change detection operates, there's this kind of magical property of Angular in that it kind of monkey patches the whole event, all of these different kinds of events that happen. That way it knows when it needs to go and change the view. So I'm not going to get into how that actually works, but the basics of it are that Angular is aware of all kinds of events that occur, and for most of them it just does the right thing, and when those events occur, it will just automatically re-render your template. However, web worker messages are not in the list of things that Angular is aware about as being a potential source of change. So what that means is anything that we do within this callback, it can happen and it can modify the properties on our various templates and on our various components and change their value. And Angular won't render those changes by default. So if I remove this line of code and run the application again, let's see what we get. Apparently I lied. This might have changed. I don't know. I could possibly be doing something different. No, at one point on some versions of Angular and some combinations of the things you do, you may not necessarily receive Angular may not necessarily receive an update saying, oh, hey, here's a new value, please re-render. I'm not sure in what way I've broken that here, and apparently I don't need this anymore, so here, we're now improving my thing live on the air. I'm going to go ahead and delete it. But in some situations, based on how you use it, you have control to say, oh, Angular, by the way, I've possibly changed my data. Please go ahead and run change detection for me. So that's what we're doing here. This.ar is a reference to our Angular application change detection mechanism, where we're saying, please go ahead and tick and do your change detection. Apparently, somewhere along the line, I lost the need for that, but now you know, if you ever need it, where to find one. Okay. So let's keep moving. So now we're going to say, all right, we've got that graph data. That graph data has some stuff flowing through it, and we're utilizing that with this links and nodes. But now we need to take a look at this throttle time here. We have to finally address that. So this throttle time is a way of telling Angular, you know what, you're receiving these updates at a very rapid pace. So that web worker that we have, it's doing some processing, changing the positions of those nodes, but it does it very, very, very fast compared to how the browser will render the changes. And so here we're saying, you know what, please go ahead and just throw away some of those. I only want to receive an update every 15 milliseconds because I can't even render any faster than that. And so it's a way of kind of taking some of those events, tossing them out, and just operating every 15 milliseconds. And so that's what the links and nodes become. It's the throttled results of that graph data. And that becomes pretty much what we kind of work off of from there. All right, let's skip this for a moment, and let's go down to update force. All right. So we have this process in our UI where there are several things that could result in the need to recalculate this list. One of them is that the HTTP results, when those come back, I need to be able to get those results and send them to my web worker. Similarly, if I type in some search criteria here, I need to be able to use that in conjunction with my results to filter this list down. So there's different situations where I need to notify that web worker that it has new data it needs to operate against. Similarly, if I change the size of this, that's another thing that needs to go and call out and say, hey, please go update your calculations. And so this update force, this is a method that we use to do that. And here's the API. Well, in order to actually send a worker a message, you call post message. So that's pretty easy. You've got a, where'd it go? You've got a on message to specify what to do whenever you get results, and a post message to send it information. And what you send it is an arbitrary piece of data. This could be any kind of data you want. For my needs, for what the worker does, I made it an object. And so I send it the list of entities that we retrieved, the list of relationships, my graph's height and width, any search terms. And then this is a kind of construct of my own doing. I'm also telling it a type of message that I'm sending it. So that way, whenever this message is received by my web worker, it knows that I actually intend for it to restart its calculation. As opposed to, up on line 115, we have a method that says, okay, what do I do when I update the search? Well, here we're pushing that into a search value observable, and we're also notifying the worker that, hey, here's a new search term, please operate against that, and we're specifying a type of filter. That way the web worker knows what kind of data I'm sending it. Okay,
hey,
so
Paul, you were talking about earlier the web workers, and at the bottom there you just had the post message, and then that will interact with what we talked about a minute ago with the on message, right? So you're sending it out and then you're getting it.
Yeah, so this is the opposite. So on message is a way of specifying what to do whenever the main application receives an update from the worker. And Post message is a way to go tell the worker some additional information. So it's like the two-way street here.
So it is like WebSockets.
Yeah, it's a lot like WebSockets. All right. So now that we've seen what that does, that update force method, let's take a look at where we use it. So here's one of those more powerful ideas behind observables, and the fact that they're actually really, they all have all kinds of operators that you can use against them. They can be composed and chained together in various ways. And one of them is called CombineLatest. And so CombineLatest is a method that we can use to say, I have two separate streams of data. In this case, I've got the data that comes back from the server, and I've represented the size of my SVG canvas as an observable as well. Knowing the size of the canvas and the server data, I need to utilize that some way to go out and make some changes with that data. Well, turns out I'm also going to need the latest value of search value. So here I'm grabbing server data and sizes. I'm saying anytime that changes, so let me just kind of drop this down here to kind of split up the code a little bit. Combine server data and sizes. Anytime either one of them changes, go ahead and execute the rest of this chain. The rest of the chain being, oh, and by the way, please give me search value. Whatever value it currently was the last time it executed, last time a new value was received. And the result is that we get to then call this method having the entities, relationships, and the height and width that were stored in that size, as well as the search value. So this is like one of those super dense lines of code I was talking about, where I'm using, was it destructuring? Is that the term?
Destructuring will be taking that back apart, but it's just a way of not having to specify the key and the value if they have the same name.
Yeah, so I'm using that to say this thing, it is an array. It has an object. On that object, we're going to represent, say, hey, it has a thing called entities, a thing called relationships. This one has a width and a height. This one has a search. Please let me refer to those properties as if they were variable names.
And I have to say, because I know we have a lot of beginners in this group, and I love the beginners because I was a beginner not that long ago. And the thing is with this rxjs, I think it was a little bit intimidating for me when I first saw it because of there was so much going on. But at the same time, what I think the beauty of these operators is once you learn the operators and you get used to using them, you have so much going on with a little tiny bit of code. And that's what I love. Like you've got more comments here than actual lines of code, right? Which is great because you can do all this functionality with a little tiny bit of code, and the operators are so powerful. And it takes a while to get to know them, but I mean, you can learn just a couple operators and get started and then add more on as you go along. Don't be intimidated by how many operators there are because those rxjs guys are just overachievers, Ben Lesh. But it's beautiful because there's so much that you can do with these operators and chaining them. It's just cool. It's cool.
Yeah, and I'll say, like, the code that we're going through, I intentionally made many passes for the sole purpose of exercising, like, how dense can I represent this and still have it be correct? And so, like, this code did not fall out of my fingers the first try. It was many passes of saying, all right, how can I tighten this? How can I tighten this? So this is not something that just kind of happens. It's not for me.
I did a lot of console logs inside there. Like every time I had the fat arrow, I had a console log going, what's going on now?
Yeah, I agree with everything that's being said. I will tell you that once you do get good with rxjs or reactive programming in general, it is amazing how many problems it solves for you in a practically declarative way. There is so much less code you have to write. On the order of like hundreds or thousands of lines of code you no longer have to write once you
right.
It's really crazy.
Yeah, it's just so I mean, I know this is complicated, but in general, like once you get to where you know several operators and you can chain them together, you're going to feel so cool. Well, there's a lot of you watching that probably already know how to do this and think I'm a big nerd, which is probably true.
Yep.
Probably quiet. Go ahead, Paul.
Yep. So at the end of the day, this is a way of saying whenever the server data changes or the size of the graph, I need to go ahead and update that using the latest search value. As the comment's calling out here, though, I don't necessarily want to go and restart my graph just because the search value changes. It's actually kind of important for one of the features here is that, like, as it's moving, I can type in to here, and I'm not actually having the graph start over again. And this is different behavior than if I resize the graph, because when I resize the graph, you see how it kind of like restarts there and kind of like freaks out for a moment before it catches back up. That's because the size, every time I change the size, it goes and it calls one of these restarts. However, anytime I change a search, we've actually informed it, please don't actually trigger this, just use the most recent value to go and perform the update. And so the difference between these two observables is very subtle, but very, very powerful and important to be, it's very important to use the right one here for the right situation. And so for this situation, I want to go notify the web worker that it needs to restart when the server data changes or the size changes, but not when the search value changes. I just need to utilize its latest value. And so
okay, so say that one more time, because you're scrambling their brains with some really heavy stuff tonight, which is awesome.
Yep.
Don't get me wrong, I like that. But say that again, the difference between CombineLatest and with latest from.
So the biggest difference is that CombineLatest, here I've only sent 2 values. You can send however many you want. And when any of those observables fires a new piece of data down the pipe, the following operators that you've chained off of it will execute again. The subscription will execute again when any of them change. With latest from, it will only fire when the observable that you've attached it to changes. It will not fire when the other observables that you pass to it as additional parameters change. It just uses their most recent value. So if you just want to know what was the last value that came out of search value, please use that to do some computation, then you would use that with latest from. However, if you wanted to change it so that searching causes the graph to start over, you would have done CombineLatest instead. So in fact, let's go ahead and put this back together for a moment. So this was my CombineLatest saying, yes, please give me those. If I were to come up here and just place that for a moment. No, let's do it this way instead. If I were to just instead also use a CombineLatest here, and do that, I need to import my CombineLatest in a slightly different way. And so now I've got CombineLatest for both. So as it restarts here, so we still have our search going, but now every time I type, you see how it also kind of jiggles much more drastically? Well, now because I've used CombineLatest instead of with latest from, the behavior is showing it so that it restarts that. And I didn't want that behavior. That actually wasn't correct for the feature I was going for. Instead, I just wanted the search to continue moving along the natural course it was, but just add and remove the ones that no longer match. And so in order to get that behavior, I had to choose carefully between the two operators and say, actually, I just want to utilize the most recent one. So I'm going to take these, combine them together with the latest value from search value to execute this method. So now if I haven't broken anything, as I type, they go away, the graph does not restart itself. It does some other calculation with that search value. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, I think it's, well, you did a quick thing with that import. What was that import thing that you did? You just like changed it quick.
Yeah, so what I did was whenever I have CombineLatest here, I put it in 2 different places. There's a bunch of different ways. If I were doing this for real, I would have just shortened the list a different way. But I'm using CombineLatest in 2 different ways here. The first is that I'm hanging it off of the observable prototype itself, or not the prototype, the actual observable class, I'm saying, hey, observable, let me call your class method called CombineLatest. And with rxjs, anytime you want to use an operator, you have to import it. And so the way I use that operator is I'm saying I want to add the observable.
So you have it as an observable and as an operator. I
Exactly,
didn't even know you could do that.
Class method called CombineLatest. The collection of operators that you can add this way is actually not the same as those that you can add as a method of the prototype.
Yeah, it's a much smaller set for these creation operators that hang directly off observable.
That's nifty. And that's why I think that's why we can make such powerful code look so nice, because with the one little change you change, and like you're being so specific with exactly the behavior that you want from this, and you have so much control by using the specific operator that you're looking for, because they're very specific. That's why there's so many of them, which is intimidating at first, but then you get to make this beautiful code.
Right. Aw, she called my code beautiful.
You do raise a really good point, though, Bonnie. Even Ben, Mr. RxJS right now, he tells people in his talks, I've seen him say this multiple times, please don't try to memorize every possible RxJS operator. Out of the box, there's literally over 100, and you can make your own, and there's people who've added more. It's overwhelming if you like sit down and you're saying, I need to know all of these. You don't need to know all of them. Even Ben says he doesn't know all of them, and he literally is the project lead for RxJS. So start small, start with the simple ones like Paul mentioned earlier. Map is a really good place to start. Do is a good place to start. Paul is giving kind of a virtuoso performance of the sort of things you can do with RxJS, but you
he is. Go ahead, sorry.
No, yeah, that's great. So that was the first usage, was I'm saying, hey, I'm going to CombineLatest. I'm going to use it as a class method or a class function. I'm just saying, you know what, let me use it this way, where I give you a list of all the observables I want you to combine together. Well, whenever you get done with this call, the end result is an observable that fires when either of these changes. And so the observable itself, an instance of that, you can also request to CombineLatest on those. And the syntax then is that all but the last parameter to that method call is going to be an additional observable. So I could come over here and add additional observables if I wanted to. And the last thing in that list needs to be your callback method. But we're not doing that. We're actually using with latest from. Similar story, though. That means that this with latest from, this is actually an instance method. And so to import it, I do use it under the word operator as opposed to the word observable.
They're like Pokemon. You got to get them all.
Yep. All right. So all of that was this kind of like fine-grained surgical way of saying, all right, here's the exact combination of when things change and at what frequency to understand when I want to call that update force method, which we saw earlier as a way of going and notifying my worker of the fact that it needed to change. All right, and so with that, I actually do something very naughty here. I subscribe to it. But I don't hang on to my subscription. So when you subscribe to an observable, you're supposed to hang on to that. And you're supposed to clean up, because if you don't, you're going to end up possibly with memory leaks. And so I did not do a very good job with that. But at the end of the day, what that ends up meaning is that this update force method will be called anytime server data or sizes change. And if I didn't subscribe to it, I would have this wonderfully crafted observable pipeline set up that never actually executes, because it's not until you subscribe that your observables actually do their work. So I'm subscribing for the side effect, if you will, of calling update force at the appropriate time. All right, ready to head into this fray again?
Yeah.
All right. I mean, I got other stuff I can talk about if you're observable out.
I've never observable out, Paul.
All right, we'll keep going then. So here we're using CombineLatest in a similar way as we'd seen before. We're using it now to combine the following. Actually, let me indent this a little bit. We're using it to combine the result of this observable chain with our search value. And here's the callback. I'm going to work my way backwards here. So with the CombineLatest, as I mentioned before, the first n-1 parameters that you send, those are all just the observables that you want to watch for changes. And the last parameter is the callback executed with those values. So here, the callback means that this first big observable here, that's just a long way of saying, okay, give me details about an entity. The second one is, okay, now give me details about the search value. All right, so here we're saying, all right, given those details, I'm now going to filter over them. And this is actually, if you're familiar with the observable filter operator, this is not it. This is just entity details is an array. It is an array of all of the entities and the number of them, number of relationships they have. Filter is just that array filter operation, the good old-fashioned, filter operation where I can say, given an entity, I'm going to see if it matches my search value, and only return the entities that match my search value. So this is just a way of saying, does this one need to be in the list? And then over here, we take the result of that computation and say, all right, given that, I'm just basically testing like, hey, does my filtered list work? This is kind of like leftover debugging code.
And that do operator is pretty handy. And
Yep.
I didn't learn that. That wasn't one of the first batch that I learned either. I didn't learn that until later, but it's actually, I love it for console logs.
Yep, do is a great way of saying, I just want to spy on the data that's flowing through here, and I don't actually want to change it in any way. I just want like this hook in which I can just poke at it and look at it.
Yep. And you can use do for other things other than console logs, I guess, if you really want to. But it just doesn't modify the data in any way or return anything. It just does something without really interfering.
Yep. That's right. All right, so what observables actually were flowing into this? So this was all downstream of a CombineLatest, where we know we're going to end up with an array of the entities, and we're going to end up with that search term, and we're going to look at them together to produce a filtered list. So what went into the entity details? Well, we're taking that server data, the result of the HTTP call. We want to map over that. We're going to say, all right, given the full list of relationships and their entities, we go and we start to craft a list. So here we're just basically saying, I have an empty list of entity details. We're going to iterate over all of the entities, and we're going to count how many relationships they have. And so this is just a way of saying, all right, given a particular entity, if we go back and look at the graph, start here for a second. We look at the graph and we kind of like pick one of these little nodes. It's like this one right here floating around. It has 1, 2, 3, 4 relationships that are immediately connected to it. And so similarly, we'll see over here on the left that there's a number next to these names, and that number represents the number of relationships that that entity has. And so this was, again, just kind of like here, let me try it out, let me see if I can do it and see what I get kind of idea. And so, yeah, now we know that, let me find a name I can pronounce here. Shirley Lowe here has 3 relationships. That comes from this pipeline right here. Given the server data, we need to transform it in some way. The server data didn't come with the information needed to know like the relationships. It has a list of relationships, it has a list of nodes. We need to compute those two things together to get a list that has the number. So that's what this does. This says, let me iterate over each one. Let me calculate the number of relationships. And I'm going to build up this entity details array by pushing a new entity with its relationship count into it. And then we return that list. And that's what flows into the first parameter of our CombineLatest. And then, of course, our search value, we saw that earlier. That was a behavior subject that we created ourselves.
And the behavior, so the difference between the subject and the behavior subject is the behavior subject requires an initial value when it starts.
Yes.
And it will always serve up, anytime someone subscribes, it will instantly deliver the latest value.
That's right.
Whereas the
Yep.
regular subject won't hold that value. It'll just fire off whenever it's triggered.
Yep.
But the behavior value will always hold the most recent one and deliver it on demand.
Yep. All right, and so we're actually starting to kind of round all this out here. Update search. Well, this is what actually put those values into that search value. So you can, the component that actually has this control, as the search value changes over time, it calls this update search method, passing it to new search value. We push that value into our observable. It will flow through and be utilized by all of these various observable pipelines, and they'll operate on it however they need to. And each time this is called, that happens again and again. Similarly, we're posting to the web worker that, hey, that search value has changed.
I like it.
All right, so
I'm glad that I didn't see this months ago because my brain would have been totally scrambled.
oh yeah, yep.
Observables for a little while. I think I got it, and it's very cool and it's good to watch. But if I had seen this 6 months ago, I wouldn't have known what you're talking about, any of it.
Yep. So let's see the other half of this. Let's go take a look at the web worker now. All right, so here is my web worker. Looks like I need to actually do an npm install on this.
We need to see Bill Odom's name over there on the people.
People. Yeah, why isn't he up there?
I don't know. I can't believe you didn't put Bill in that list.
All right, so come on.
Give red squigglies. See what happens when you
Oh, no.
live code.
All right. All right.
I don't know how you get a word in edgewise with Corey on the panel.
All right, so that should be less angry at me. So the idea behind the web worker is that, again, this is kind of executing in its own thread. This wasn't brought in because of some sort of script tag on your HTML or anything like that. It wasn't bundled in as part of your JavaScript bundle. This thing was loaded at runtime on demand by our JavaScript code. So like that line that we saw right here is at that point that this code is actually loaded into the browser. It's put in its own little isolated execution thread. So it has no idea what kind of global JavaScript variables might be on your page. Completely different scope for everything. And so that means it needs to also grab its own collection of JavaScript libraries that it might need to use in order to do its job. So in the context of a web worker, you have access to this thing called import scripts. This is a way of saying, hey, please go fetch these JavaScript files from the server. And so here with my build process, I just made all of the D3 and Lodash libraries available to it. So like these are kind of sitting on the root of my server, ready to go, ready for this worker.js file to come along and grab them.
So with the web workers, it's not like you're just passing something in an event. With the web worker, you could execute JavaScript and do whatever you need to do off to the side.
Right, right. So like over here, I could come down here and start putting whatever kind of arbitrary JavaScript I wanted, or before the on message. Like this is just whatever kind of JavaScript you want to execute in this context. However, the whole point of these web workers is to actually do some sort of communication back and forth to the creator of the web worker. And so to do that, you should implement called on message. So if you make a thing called on message and make it and assign it to a callback, it will automatically get called anyone sends you a message from the creator of the worker. So this on message function will be executed anytime the client code calls post message.
I love this. I wish I had this back in 2013. Like when I first made more than one Angular. Well, the first time I made an Angular directive was tragic, but then I had more than one that was trying in one application, I was trying to communicate between two directives like way back in the day. And it was so hard. Like, life is so much easier now. We could just go, oh yeah, make me a web worker. Easy breezy. I love this. And I actually didn't, I mean, I had heard web workers and I knew that they were out there, but I hadn't really paid attention until I started poking around in this repo. So I have you to thank for that, or blame.
Yep, you're welcome. Either way.
One thing to kind of point out that this kind of shot myself in the foot real early on learning web workers is that when you spin up a web worker, you're kind of blocked from touching the DOM at all. Like, it's purely just JavaScript calculations. You can't really touch the DOM.
Oh, that's right. I saw that. I forgot all about that. That's a good point, Corey.
Yeah, kind of like this post message and like this messaging back and forth is just our web worker talking to the other thread that can touch the DOM, our main thread.
Right. Good point.
Yeah, and you're not even in, like Paul mentioned earlier, you're not in the same scope. Like the window, the globals that are available on the browser's window objects are not there. There's stuff that you can't get to. You really are off in a different, I don't want to say thread, but it really is, not the same thread that you're running your normal JavaScript code in. But that doesn't stop you from using things like, AJAX requests and talking to WebSockets, but you can't go and mess with the DOM.
Yep. All right, so I've implemented onMessage. So I know this is going to be called whenever someone posts a message to me. And like I said, I actually did the events that we send it. I had this thing going on. Let me see if I can get this side by side here. I had this thing going on where in all of the messages that I post, I made sure the object had a property called type. And over here, that allows me to actually kind of like safely make sure that the message I received was one that I recognized and knew how to take action against. So, for example, here I'm checking like, oh, is my message, is it of type restart or is it of type filter? And I take different actions based upon that. And so before I take any kind of action, though, the first thing I do is actually make a reference to a bunch of, well, in this case, this simulation right here. This is going to refer to some D3 boilerplate that we're going to look at and mostly hand wave over in a moment. But the simulation, this is going to house the process and the code used to create this the data for where the positions of all these nodes and links are. And so we'll take a look at it in a moment. But I'm very intentionally creating it outside. So this is something that when I first got started, I really struggled with. And it was like, once I realized it was kind of an aha, and when it was simultaneously a duh kind of moment, it's very important to, if you have information that you want to persist between messages, like that's totally okay that you can do that. And it's really easy. You just make sure that the memory references to that information, that they were created outside of onMessage. And anytime that you make an assignment in your onMessage, then that will be available the next time you re-enter that onMessage call. And so
everybody watching online, raise your hand if you've ever had an aha moment and a duh moment at the same time.
Yep. And so that was one of those. I had one of those here. For the longest time, I kept like recreating my simulation in the message, and my graph just kept restarting every time it tried to fire. It was really obnoxious.
I've got a quick question. Does the web worker, is its life cycle the same as like the page it's attached to? So if the user refreshes the page, does the web worker kind of refresh and lose its memory?
So the answer to the second half is yes. When you refresh, it will, it'll tear it down and start it back up again. As far as the life cycle beyond the answer to that question, I don't know. I don't know if it kind of like literally shuts itself down and like persists in some other weird way and comes back to life. I don't know that much about it in that regard, but I do know every time you refresh the page, it will instantiate all of this all over again.
You know how I did in my meetup when I started, Corey? If you ask a question the speaker doesn't know, you're the next speaker.
Okay, so as I was saying, we take that event that arrives. An event is not actually like a one-to-one map to what you post to it. Event, it actually has some other properties on it. For this application, the only one we care about though is the data. The data is just a keyword that will exist on any event that arrives to your on message. You just kind of have to like look at the API and know that that is a thing that you have to access. But the data for your message, that's where your actual object will live. So that data represents these objects I'm sending over. And I said each one has a type. And so I extract out the search term, if there is one, and I extract out the type. And then I look at the type to determine what to do. And so if the type is restart, here's where we get into the D3 boilerplate. And I even have in here in the comments, like, please go read and understand D3 for simulation stuff. I'm not going to get into it other than to say, this is how you set one up. And we're going to jump straight to line 50. Line 50 is where we get a chance to say, okay, at this point, D3 has changed the X and Y coordinates of our things. What would you like to do with that updated information? And so this is our chance to say, I have new coordinates for my things. I need to now go notify the owner of this web worker about their new relationships. All right. So first thing we do is we find out, hey, do we have any filtered entities yet? If not, then let's go ahead and filter those based upon the search term. So here we're doing that search. You know, notice we've already done a search over in the other file. Like over here, we already looked at some search code. The search code that we looked at here, that was for sorting this list. Here, we would like it if D3 went ahead and, like, as part of its calculation, did the sorting over here. Why not get that onto another thread while we're at it? So that's what it's doing. It's sorting what shows in the graph as opposed to what shows in the list. And here's our chance. We're saying, all right, our list of filtered entities, we're just going to iterate over all the entities and do that same search function, produce that filtered list. Similarly, based on the entities that were filtered, we're going to go ahead and create a list of filtered relationships. And so now that we have a list of filtered entities and a list of filtered relationships, we're going to go ahead and post a message back to our caller, the creator of this, the owner of this web worker. So just as our client code was able to post a message to the web worker, our web worker can in turn post a message back. And so here we're posting a message saying, here are your new relationships and entities with their brand new X and Y coordinates, and we've also filtered out those that don't match your search term. So this is now our all set, ready to go results being sent down. And so now we can come back here, we can complete the loop. So here's what we were doing when we were sending data. Now we got to go back and find where we caught those. We already looked at the code, but I just want to kind of revisit it now. And so here we said, okay, great. Here's where I'm going to capture those events. Okay, here's my new freshly sorted entity and relationship list. I'm going to go ahead and put that into the graph data subject and let that flow on down through the rest of the system. And the remainder of this is just more of the D3 boilerplate that we're not really going to take a look at.
You mean we don't have time to learn D3 too? We learn rxjs and D3 all in 1 hour.
Let's see. So Bonnie, let's hear you do a talk on ngHouston.
Yeah, the first time I had to work with D3 on a project, and I was like, no problem. And I thought it was like, you know, some little thing. And then I looked at it and I started realizing very quickly, like, D3 is really complicated. It's powerful. It's very cool, but it's not a simple thing.
If you want to feel like you have no idea what you're doing, just go say, oh, I'm just going to naively implement this D3 thing. It looks so easy. Like the second you try to modify it at all, you just like run into this wall of, I should not be a developer. This is terrible. I have no idea what I'm doing. That's what happens when you use a bunch of code written by PhDs. Like it's just, it's tough.
It's hard. It's kind of what I've been going through with Esrimat with the ArcGIS stuff. Like
Yeah,
you get into
yeah.
some of this, it's huge. It's massive.
All right, so the other message was filter, and so this was the notion that, but you know what? Every once in a while, I would like this graph here, like as it's still wiggling around and moving. I want to be able to just produce a new set of filtered results as opposed to the whole list. And so this is what's been used to create a list of the filtered entities and relationships. And then we saw earlier in my tick handler here, where if I already have a list of filtered entities, we don't go and recompute them. We just go ahead and post them each time they have their XY coordinates updated. So here's another way in which we can set them. All right, so that is the observable data flow web worker Angular integration cycle. There was a bunch of stuff there, and so I probably should call it there and just take some questions, but I got plenty more that you can check out here. Just the highlights of the other things that this integrates with, and remember, this is a, you shouldn't necessarily do this. I just wanted to like throw as much technology into one thing as I could until it falls over. Has examples of how to do things like service workers. That way you can cache your resources for offline mode, things of that nature. So you can do offline mode, you can do caching of resources, not only of your assets, but of API calls, all kinds of stuff like that, that this takes advantage of. It's doing things like AOT and a whole bunch of other kind of Angular performance recommendations. And so there's all kinds of various tips and tricks that you can kind of glean from it if you study the code for a while. So yeah, check it out. It's got all kinds of fun stuff in it. I got a very rough roadmap for like some things that I would also like to do. This one's actually coming very, very soon. So if you want to learn how to use request animation frame, that's like pretty much done. I just got to get the thing to deploy. Other than that, I'd like to actually expand it to include things like, show me how this behaves if I don't use track by. Show me how this behaves if I'm not using on push. And actually let the user control that and kind of examine the performance difference as a result. So those are my hopeful upcoming features. We'll see how it actually goes though.
Well, I have to say, I mean, you covered quite a bit tonight, and I know a lot of this stuff, especially if you are not too familiar with this stuff, some of this stuff was kind of intimidating, but really this is really, I think, a really good demo. I keep saying really. I liked this when I went through the GitHub repo because, number one, even though some of this code is kind of intimidating, but it's actually written in a very clean way, and it's organized in a very clean way, and it's got pretty generous comments sprinkled in through there. So if this doesn't make sense, then I definitely would say go in there and poke around that repo, because it really, this stuff, the first time I saw it didn't make sense to me either, but you have to kind of get exposure to this so that you can learn how to use it all. And it's really a good demonstration of there's a lot going on in a small amount. So it's actually a really good demo. I like this a lot. Thank you so much for coming and walking us through it. And I'm sorry that I stopped you so many times with so many questions, but I was very interested in all this. But you did pretty well. It's like right at 8 o'clock. So you actually timed that pretty well. Like it's like you were expecting all of my questions.
No, I appreciate the chance to come on and just kind of talk through it, and interested to see what others think of it.
Yeah, you were a panelist a couple times, and I'm really glad that we finally had you. We got to put you in the hot seat.
Yeah.
I know it's not always easy to be in the hot seat, but we appreciate it. This was a lot of fun.
Yeah, it was fun. Thank you.
Thank you. Sean, Corey, y'all have any questions before we go? Or Bill?
Well, actually, building on what you just said, there is so much in here that I've actually asked Paul this question before, and it was really useful, so I'm asking it for the benefit of others. Given that there's so much stuff here, what's the low-hanging fruit for Angular performance? Where would you start? You don't have to do all of this to make a more performant web app. What 2 or 3 things would you go after first?
Yeah, so I actually it's called the Angular Performance, Angular Performance Playground, but we didn't really talk about performance at all.
I know I said that when in the demo, I said, we're going to talk about performance. And then about halfway through it, I was like, I should have said, we're going to talk about rxjs. Sorry, that was my fault.
Yeah,
guys.
yeah. Well, but that leads directly into my my answer for this is that, like, as you start to build out more complex Angular applications, and as you start to kind of embrace immutability and observables a little bit more often, the downside to just kind of like picking a couple of operators that you know and are familiar with and just using them, definitely start that way. But as you start to build up any kind of real complexity with that, you start to hit kind of performance, unexpected performance complications. And it's not that rxjs is slow, it's that, you know, using it in a naive way can lead you into trouble. And so, like we talked about earlier, I did show that one little trick where you can actually throw in a publish replay or a share replay or a share and improve some performance by simply like cutting out entire duplicated code paths. Like they get run more than once in your application. So just kind of being cognizant of things like that. Another one was the difference between the CombineLatest and the with_latest from. You know, in addition to it not being quite the right behavior, it also makes it less performant, because if I had any kind of significant code in here in terms of like computational cost associated with the code that was inside here, then that would have been run anytime I typed a character into that input box. And that would have, in A, I didn't need that, and B, I didn't want that, but if it could have very easily slid in there and gone unnoticed until it became a big problem.
Right.
So just kind of like being very intentional about your use of observables has really actually been the #1 thing I've been on the look for using this. And I would say the second biggest thing is also related to immutability. Whenever you're dealing with your, drill down to it here, let me find where it's hiding. When you're dealing with your templates, and if you're dealing with immutability, track_by. Track_by is a huge performance boost. I know we didn't talk about it, but it's a way of kind of helping Angular out. Whenever you keep changing the list of relationships, in this case, I'm changing the list of relationships every 15 milliseconds. And rather than having Angular like tear down and throw away the whole list of DOM that it previously rendered and starting over from scratch, I have a way of saying, no, calm down, it's okay. These entities, I want you to actually do a custom comparison. And if the display names are the same, consider those things to be the same entity. And don't destroy and tear down the DOM, just update anything that actually changed within it. And so it's a way of greatly reducing the amount of work Angular has to do in updating your templates when you're iterating over large lists of entities.
So track_by, the way that you use track_by right there in the ngFor, even if you're not using that at all in that HTML file, you're just doing that to make it easier for Angular to do its job.
Right. I'm not invoking that track_line_by method anywhere. I am handing a method, essentially handing this method to Angular, saying, when you're comparing these entities to one another, use this method for comparison as opposed to object quality, because behind the scenes, I've replaced the object on you. You're going to need a little help.
Yeah, like Paul was saying, that is all related to helping Angular know if it needs to destroy and create DOM nodes, which is an extremely expensive operation. Literally earlier today, I was working with John, also here at Oasis Digital, and the proper use of a couple of track_bys shaved 4 seconds off of a table rebuild. I mean, it's insane how much of a performance change something like track_by can give you.
It's pretty awesome.
That track_by, it's used so often. I'm pretty sure the Codalizer, the Angular linter, I'm pretty sure there's a rule you can even turn on to enforce that all ngFors use track_by in your project, just to kind of help encourage the performance best practices.
That's awesome. Speaking of helping, so if we have people watching who really need help figuring all this out and they want you to just slow down and go all the way to the beginning and go through this, maybe come out to their office
You show up
They
and
can
not,
actually
right?
hire you guys for that, right? So
Yeah.
Angular Bootcamp, you guys do public training, and you also do private in-house corporate training.
That's correct. So if you're already on the Angular Performance Playground app, the About page, it has a couple of links where you can go and check us out. AngularBootcamp.com. That's where we do our training. Oasis Digital Solutions. That's where we do our sort of contract work out of.
So they can teach you how to do it, or they can do it for you. You pick. Either way.
And actually, it's a combination of both. We have multiple projects going on right now where the people who we're doing it for are also participating in the project. So it's kind of a combo of, yes, consulting and development work is being done, but also it's elevating the skill level of the people on the team of the client.
Yeah, that's the way to do it, because you can go in there and look at what they're trying to accomplish and really have that targeted, let me teach you exactly what you need to do what you're trying to do. That's what I do sometimes when I'm doing consulting with clients. Is like, do you want me to teach you or do it for you? And they say both. I'm like, okay, just get me started, and then I can handle it from there.
And of course, if you have like questions about this or kind of things you've seen, my Twitter handle's on there. You can find me on Twitter. You can go on GitHub and ask questions about it. It's not like you gotta pay me to answer questions. But if you do need something a little more formal, a little more in depth, that's always an option.
You totally have to pay me. I'm not answering any questions without money.
Bill, you're a hoot, Bill. Well, that's awesome, and I think this is a good place to wrap it, because we have some people whose brains are tired. But this was really cool, Paul. I really appreciate you putting this all together, and the documentation's really nice. All those code comments are nice, and the GitHub repo is out there, and it's public. You guys are welcome to go poke around, look at it, ask Paul lots of questions. And thank you, Paul. You should absolutely come back actually, you should come back with this and like do it again in 6 months or a year and show us like how it's evolved over time and like keep on building more stuff to it.
Now you're actually going to make me actually keep going with it. So
yeah, you can blame it on me. Well, this was really cool. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you coming and doing this, and we will see you soon. And thanks, panel.
You bet. Thank you, guys.
Thanks.